In this video, we want to talk about total quality management and quality tools. And in particular, we want to talk about the major developments over time that have happened within our thinking of total quality management. What are the major events and who were the major contributors that have led to the way we think about total quality management today? So we want to look at the whole development of the concept and who was behind it and what was behind it. First of all, it's important to note that there is a relationship between ethics and quality. There's a whole list of issues here we could look at. The substandard work, for example. There's clearly an ethical issue about the production and selling of substandard work. And if customers are desperate to receive the product and are in a sense forced to accept substandard work, then there's some sort of ethical obligation on the part of the organization to fix that. It may mean less profits, but the trade-off is that people get work that they believe is of good quality, they get good products, it meets their requirements, and it's not just put together for profit sake. So within the substandard work, we've got defective products which are likely to break down, they're not made appropriately, they're not going to work. We have a substandard service. Perhaps products are sold and the products need backup service, they need perhaps intervention from personnel within the company for instructions and setup reasons, how to use the product, documentation, and perhaps that's substandard as well. It could be the product is simply poor design. It's the only one available, customers must take it or leave it, but it's not really the design they want. They want a different product, ideally, one more tuned to their requirements. The workmanship is just shoddy. It doesn't look well, it doesn't look good, it's not really complete, the finish is not very good, and the workings of the product, it may not be entirely reliable. So again, there's an ethical issue. Ownership of the work. Who is responsible for the substandard work? It may be difficult to track down who is responsible for the substandard work. And there are many items sold in shops and it's difficult to work out who the producer is exactly. So if there's something wrong with the product or the product becomes dangerous even, it may be difficult to trace back to where the product started. And that's particularly an issue now because markets are so globalized. There could also be substandard parts and materials. It could be the case that, for example, we buy a car and we believe it to be good quality and we believe it to be original parts, and later we find out it's substandard parts and materials which have been passed off as the originals. Now that's cheating, that's lying, it's deceit, it's unethical. And we can see how ethics overlinks with quality in many ways. So it's important to bear in mind that in our discussions of quality we are also somehow undertaking a discussion of ethics and the view of what is the right thing to do. So there are ethical implications of bad quality work, and that should be borne in mind. Now, the evolution of quality management. Well, 1924 is a date that's often quoted because statistical process control charts were starting to be used around that time, gradually coming into bigger companies, car industry and so on, and there was a phasing in of this idea of the use of statistics and metrics, counting and measurement, coming in to look at quality and look at the output of the company. Then it came tables for acceptance sampling, tables based on statistics of when should a sample be accepted. If a sample is taken from the output of the company and tested, measured or whatever, at what point should the output of the company be acceptable? If the sample has some defects, then should all the sample be rejected and all of the output of the company rejected, or should it be accepted and in full knowledge that there will be customers unsatisfied or dissatisfied, I should say, with the product? They'll be left unhappy about the product because they've purchased the product in good faith and there are defects. But the company knew there would be defects because the sample said there would be some, just that the sample was statistically acceptable. So there were tables brought out to help companies decide that. Then there was statistical sampling techniques themselves, randomly selecting output from the flow of output within the company, testing every perhaps 100th item. That would be sequential sampling, or randomly sampling. Random sampling is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to pick random sampling because the methodology for random sampling is very difficult unless we draw balls out of a black bag and we can't see what we're drawing. That may be random, but selecting a random sample otherwise is very difficult. It involves us, and we tend to be sequential, and we tend to not to be very random in the way we select items. So it may be sequential sampling or some other form of sampling technique, but these were sort of introduced around the 1940s. Companies became more interested in measuring the quality of their output and sampling the output to see if it was of a good standard, and seeing if the sample was large and properly selected, then the output of the sample was an indicator of the quality of the full run, and companies could make some projections then about the quality of their product. 1950s brought quality assurance and total quality control, this idea of trying to ensure that there would be quality within the business and looking at the full range of issues that could lead to quality within the business. The full range being production, training of personnel, raw materials, distribution, logistics, and so on. Looking at overall what would lead to a good quality product at the end. So they were starting to think along those lines around the 1950s. 1960s it got dramatic. People were looking for zero defects, and there were theories and ideas around which suggested that if there was a single defect, then the whole batch should be scrapped and go back and make it again. The company should not tolerate defects. Now we've got something similar in modern day thinking. We call it Six Sigma, and it's the subject of a separate video. But that's around 3.4 defects per million output. Now that's a very, very strict quality measure. It means almost zero defects. But in the 1960s, people were talking about zero defects. It doesn't mean that they were actually doing it, but the ideas were starting to gain ground. And in the 1970s, quality was moved also over to services to try and make sure that services were of a good quality, not just physical products, but services as well. So some history of quality. Well, pre-World War II, in the 1920s, the physicist Shewhart in the Bell Labs studied variation in production processes for the first great US national telephone network. So Schuhart was looking at variations in the product processes and what caused the variations, and at what point would the variations be so big that they were unacceptable. At what point could they be tolerated? So there was a thinking about quality as far back as the 1920s. So he studied quality variation, but also used statistical control charts to try and work out what was acceptable. There could be an upper limit and a lower limit in terms of quality, and then chart the actual quality of the service in between, and if it fell outside the lower end or above the upper end, it could trigger off some sort of intervention by management. So it was getting close to the way we think nowadays about management intervention and looking at quality. And it was also starting to use metrics, starting to measure the output to see to what extent the output conformed to what the company said. So it was quite a dramatic development. In the 1940s, New York University statistics professor Deming studied Schuhart's book. So in the 1940s, this early work was now taken out again, dusted off, and studied this time by Deming. And he developed 14 points, which will be the subject of a separate video. But he developed 14 points talking about quality. And there's also this idea of plan, do, study, act. Plan, do, study, act, this cycle, which again is mentioned in separate videos. The PDSA cycle. Plan something, do it, study it, and act it out, and then go back and plan it again based on the feedback from the cycle. So it's a constant improvement situation. Sometimes known as Deming's wheel, but it crops up in separate videos. During World War II, well, during World War II, lots of innovations in many areas were proposed. During World War II, governments were only too willing to listen to ideas, and companies were looking for ideas all the time. So World War II was a hotbed for innovation in industry. People were trying to maximize output and look at quality and look at all sorts of issues during the Second World War in an effort to win the war. But clearly, of course, quality was important in the armaments trade. It was not acceptable to send armaments to the soldiers on the front line, armaments that were defective, for example, or of poor quality. It was essential that the soldiers received good quality products. So the idea of quality was very important during the Second World War. In the 1930s, Hodge and Rummig from Bell Labs studied accepting a lot after partial inspection. So the idea here is to take a sample, in modern language, take a sample and inspect the sample and then draw a conclusion about the whole output. And in a way, if you think about that in the context of the Second World War, making, say, guns, well, they can't test all of the guns. That would be ridiculous. And they certainly can't test all the guns to see how long they're going to last, because if they did, they'd have no guns left. They'd have wasted all the gun. So they're drawing a sample. If the sample was drawn correctly, then they could get some indication as to the quality of the guns. And this applied a lot during the Second World War, and for many production areas, because even in the consumer areas, when products were made, they had to be made to last and to be durable and good quality. So there was a lot of emphasis on quality during the Second World War. This idea of Dodge and Rummig the acceptance sampling. Is a lot of N products good if a sample of small n, or n is less than big N, products contains only C defects? So is the overall production acceptable if there, in a sample of a certain size, there's only so many defects? Or does the presence of the defects mean that the overall level of output is bad and it needs to be relooked at and scrapped and done again? So what is the approach to quality? What's acceptable and what's not? And don't forget, back in the 1930s and during the Second World War into the 1940s, early 40s, this was all new thinking in industry. Nobody had really thought about quality at that stage. It's almost as if industry was too new. Industry had been around since the Industrial Revolution, which really started in England in about 1760s. But industry on a mass scale was really just creeping in the 20th century, and in America in particular. So now we're talking about the quality of the output. The whole discussion of business and management has moved on considerably by the 1930s and into the Second World War in the 1940s. Now they're talking about the quality of the output, measuring the quality, trying to determine at what point the number of defects in a sample should mean that the output itself is not acceptable. So that's quite a big departure. 1940s, well, Statistical Research Group at Columbia University, supported by the US War Department, studied variations of acceptance sampling, such as sequential sampling. Their work grew into MIL standard, 105D, quality standard, and this became ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, standard for quality. So there were very early ones. I don't expect anyone to be familiar with the MIL standard 105D. I think I've only seen a reference to it once or twice myself. But doesn't matter. The fact is it grew into ANSI, which is something we should be familiar with. It's the American National Standards Institute, which is one of the key players in quality globally, even today. But certainly was one of the earlier instigators of change in terms of quality and the emphasis on quality in industry back from the 1940s into the 50s and so on. So it's all growing out of earlier developments. Thinkers and academics are starting to focus in on quality and trying to get some measures of quality. Now, just after the Second World War, there was general disregards for quality in many areas. Many people thought all of this talk about quality, and particularly during the Second World War, was perhaps overdone, and now businesses need to get back to making goods and selling them. And it was a bit like caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Let the buyer look after the quality. The buyer will make a decision at the point of purchase, and if they decide to buy it, it's their responsibility. So there's no responsibility on the part of the company to have a good quality. It's the onus is on the buyer. So that seemed to have been the thinking back by the the late 40s and into the 50s. As I say here, Deming and Juran, also Schuhart, Dodge and Rummick, all the big thinkers in this area, they went to Japan to advocate quality. They were not making progress in America. There was a lot of opposition from industry about quality, and they saw it as intervention by government and anti-capitalist and so on. So in the end, the big thinkers went to Japan. These are American academics, American industrialists, business thinkers, and they went to Japan to advocate quality. So the left America. Deming, Duran, and Shuhart, Dodge, Romick advocate quality, mainly in Japan. That's the big movement now. So they're now ensconced in Japan advocating quality. And you can see where this is going in terms of competition and subsequent development of quality initiatives and who wins the competitive battle in the long run. So the emphasis here was quality as the basis for future competition. Well, we can see now the foundations of the Japanese phenomenon that existed throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and is still around. Other countries, I should say, and other companies as well, have now tried to claw back some of the initiative, and they are now emphasizing quality. But it was the Japanese who accepted the need for quality, and they were the ones who integrated this whole quality thinking into their production systems, their emphasis on quality, and that, of course, meant that their products were seen as high status and valued by customers in the West as well as in Japan. So quality became the basis for future competition. Quality and productivity are positively correlated. So when you have good quality production, then you have less spoils, less defects, less wasted material, less wasted time, less wasted resources within the business. Productivity increases. So they emphasized these points to the Japanese, and the Japanese accepted the argument. And it was a responsibility of upper management. Quality had to permeate the whole organization. Quality had to start at the top and run all the way through the organization, from the senior executive at the top right down to somebody on the production line. Everyone had an emphasis on quality. Quality was driven home. It was the mantra. It was what they did. And there was a need for continuous improvement. And you can see here the basis for total quality management. The idea that they would not be complacent about the quality. They would continually improve the quality. Greater emphasis on quality. In the 1960s, Freienbaum unified and integrated view of quality also resonated in Japan rather than the US. So Freienbaum's contribution was recognized in Japan. It's as if all of the quality gurus, all of the big thinkers in quality needed a platform, and the only place they could find it was in Japan. So the Japanese accepted the need for quality, and all the rest of the world trundled along making products with defects and poor quality, and just made things and left it to the buyer to be responsible for the quality. It was the Japanese now who were starting to adopt quality, build it into their production systems, greater emphasis on quality, and it was largely based on the thinking of these American academics who had gone over to preach quality to them. Crosby, well, in the 1960s, P.B. Crosby went to the extreme. He went 0 defects. Now, today we talk about 6 sigma, which is, I think, as I said to you earlier, is 3.4 defects per million output. So if we made 1 million of the products, we can't have more than 3.4 defects. Almost none. So it's very similar. I mean, Crosby was preaching 6 sigma before it became anywhere near popular. But it was called 0 defects. Again, big emphasis on quality. The idea was to do it right the first time. And this became a strong tenet of the just-in-time policy. Make sure that the products arrive just in time, make sure it's done properly, make sure it's done properly the first time. There's total quality management as well, that the quality of the product is perfect every time. There's no going back and doing it. There's no wasted resources. There's no machines being used twice for the same activity. Productivity is increased. Customer satisfaction is increased. There are a lot of benefits out of doing this, and you can trace back to where these ideas were. Now, there are recent quality trends, the ISO series, for example, and quality certification, say ISO 9000, that series which deals with quality. It's a set of international standards on quality management and quality assurance, essential for international business. So international businesses try to get this accreditation. It means that their products are good quality and their processes are quite robust. The ISO 9000 series standard requires firms to document their quality control systems at every step so that they may be able to identify those areas that are causing quality problems and correct them. So it's a detailed approach to quality. The companies have to itemize every quality step and monitor their production very carefully, make notes, and make sure that quality is seen through all the way from start to finish. And that's the essence of the ISO 9000. It's a hierarchical approach to documentation of quality management systems, and in fact there are several ISO standards, all in the 9000 series, that relate to specific functions and specific areas, as we'll see in a moment. Now, the registration process, well, when an organization feels that its quality system is good enough, it may ask for pre-assessment. It may ask to be looked at by the organization for accreditation. The final audit begins with a review of the company's quality manual. The audit team checks if the documented quality systems meet the requirements of ISO 9000. So it's quite an arduous process, getting this accreditation to make sure that it's of good quality, good standard. The company has to go through a lot of processes. It has to meet the requirements of the accrediting body. When the registrar is satisfied with the favourable recommendations of the audit team, it grants registration and issues a registration document to the company. However, it will maintain the standard by making visits and having follow-up inspections to make sure that the standard is being maintained. It's not issued once for all time. It's issued for a limited period of time, then it must be updated, and the company will have to go through the process again to make sure that its registration is current. The quality management principles, well, a systems approach to management. It looks at management and it looks at how the management is structured and the importance that quality is built into each part of the management functions, the emphasis it has on quality, and making sure that the management are not just motivated for quality, but they have an understanding of the importance of quality. There's continual improvement. Well, this is the Tqm idea, that there is a constant striving for quality, a constant emphasis on quality right throughout the organization. And as far as possible, to try to have a factual approach to decision making. Try to use metrics, try to use measurements, and use hard data if possible to try and get a fix on quality, to make sure that quality is what the company said it is. So do measurements and perform statistical calculations. Mutually beneficial supplier relationships should be developed. So suppliers should be integrated into the process if possible. They should be spoken to. The advantages of collaboration should be mentioned and discussed, and they should be factored in so that efficiency is also fostered. They will make deliveries on time when promised, and they will deliver the right quality raw materials. So quality is running backwards into the supplier chain, back along the supply chain to the suppliers, so the quality of the inputs are good. Quality is running right throughout the whole system. But the focus is on the customer. The customer is looking for a product of the right standard with the right specifications. It must meet the customer's requirements. So the focus is on the customer. Everything is pointing towards the customer and towards customer requirements. And there must be leadership for quality. There must be a champion who oversees quality and to make sure that all of the processes are running as per the requirements of the accrediting agency. What was agreed during the accreditation process should be implemented, not just spoken about. And there should be leadership to make sure that that happens. And people should be involved in the whole process. It's important that inspections, for example, happen continuously. And the only way to do that is to get the operators on the floor to make inspections as the output is produced. Just look at the products to see that they look okay and they generally conform to what was expected. The detailed measurements should happen randomly, and there should be sampling on a continuous basis, more formally and statistically. But that does not stop the operators from just simply looking at the output to make sure the machines are not leaving loose ends or the tools don't need updating or whatever. So it involves people right throughout the organization. And the process of quality should be emphasized. It's part and parcel of what the company does in making the product, but they're also making an attribute of the product, which is the quality, and that process, that emphasis on quality, should be understood by everyone. They're not just simply making a product, they're making a product with certain quality. So the product is, in a sense, augmented. It's augmented by this quality qualification, and the operators and the management should be aware that the product is only complete if it's got those quality credentials as well. So, just to finish off, looking at this ISO series, we could have the ISO 14000, which looks at environmental issues. So we have this standard for all sorts of areas. We could have it looking at environmental issues. We have the 9000 series, 9001, looking at digital control and services. We have 9002 looking at purchasing, contracting and process control. And you can see they're almost subsets of each other. They're getting more detailed. They're focusing in on particular functions of the business and ensuring that those functions are good quality. And then ISO 9003, looking at production, inspecting and testing. So this whole idea of the ISO series, in a sense, cascades down to where we want to be. If we want to look at production, inspection and testing, then that's where we're going to be. We're at 9003. And in a sense, 9003, there's an overlap to some extent with 9002 to make sure that the purchasing is done correctly and therefore the production is done correctly. There's good contracting and process control at the 9002 stage. There might be design control and services also in terms of production to make sure that the product is appropriately designed. It meets standard requirements, legal requirements, as well as market requirements. And the service itself is issued in line with the expectations of the customers and indeed what is generally expected within the commercial sphere. That the product is delivered in good quality, in good time, at the price that was agreed, and so on. So these are some of the issues related to total quality. The purpose of this particular video is to just run across the development of the idea and look at some of the big names and look at the importance of quality as it emerged. The interesting bit is that after the war, the Second World War, there was almost a return to old habits amongst many industrialists, and it was left for the customer to decide the quality at the point of purchase. Whereas the big thinkers in the area went to Japan, and the Japanese seemed to build this in. And of course, we know later, with the advent of big corporations that seem to take over the electronics world and even car production and many areas, that the contribution of quality into their production methods led to an increase in their reputation and hence an increase in their penetration into markets. And I suppose to some extent they were one of the earlier globalized businesses, or globalized countries almost. They were selling so widely overseas. So these are the issues that we've identified in this particular class. Look over it again and make your own notes and do some research in the area. It's quite a fascinating area because it's of such importance, and yet it seems to be broadly misunderstood by so many people in business. That's all I'm going to deal with in this session, so thank you for watching.